The following podcast contains opinion and commentary protected by the First Amendment and fair use. It may also contain adult themes, adult concepts, and adult language not suitable for children. Viewer discretion is advised.
Shall take and finger scan, bond is set, now that's the plan. In a court when she will sit, felony charges aren't your shit. Rachel Mitchell has your name, you have no one else to blame. The game is set, the die is cast. Pregnancy fakers just won't last. Forging tests and faking docs, soon she'll be wearing prison Crocs. You've got nowhere else to hide, justice this time will be denied. No appeal will save your ass, you've got no tissue left to pass. The game is set, the die is cast. Pregnancy fakers just won't last. Forging tests and faking docs, so she'll be wearing prison Crocs. You've got nowhere else to hide, justice this time won't be denied. No appeal will save your ass, you've got no tissue left to pass. Justice for Clayton, Mike and Greg, and other than that she's misled. Protection orders gotta go from the moon, but where he home. Fetal, she is a con and not your pal. She'll have you by the balls when the pregnancy calls. She's the Femme, Fetal. Laura Owens, goose is cooked for arraignment, you'll be booked. Books are taken, finger scan, bond is set, now that's the plan. In the courtroom she will sit, felony charges aren't your shit. Rachel Mitchell has your name, you have no one else to blame.
Welcome everyone back to your favorite cubbyhole on the internet. It is the eve of hump day. Yes, it is Wednesday evening. I should call this Cubbyhole After Dark. No, how about Cubbyhole at Dusk? Yes, I might need to get some jazzy music and we'll talk about things in sort of a slightly ASMR voice. That might be fun. Maybe I'll consider that. One thing at a time. But we are back. We're back with more Laura Owens craziness. But some community announcements first, because these things have been weighing on my mind for some reason. I found myself troubled at all of the nonsense that poor Lauren Knighty and Megan Fox and Tug have been going through as they've tried to cover things that interest them, and they offer their opinions and they offer their very fleshed out ideas about the things they're covering. And all these insane people trying to go after them or sue them or dox them every which way from Sunday. It troubles me, and it bothers me that we can't even have discussions about things that are important, especially in the legal system, without risking a great deal, potentially risking safety, among other things. It seems like there's just a lot of disturbed and damaged people wanting to be arrested and thrown in prison for the rest of their lives for being stupid and trying to silence people, and by doing so with disgusting and illegal means. So that's a community announcement, and I have a low tolerance for that kind of behavior. I see any of that bullshit on my channel, you're just going to get booted. That's going to be my solution. I just don't have the time for that. And I'm certainly not going to let someone wage a war against me. So you've been warned. This is the community warning that hopefully I should never have to give. And speaking of community warnings, no, this is not really a warning. It's just a friendly little reminder. I'm not going to censor myself unless it starts edging towards terms of service issues. So no, I will not be using phrases like what the flock and all those other cute things that Megan Fox even created a charming little tune. What the flock? Go flock yourself. No. She's already got the copyright on that. That's her trademark. I will not be wading into those waters. And after all of the years of oppression that I have endured in a religious cult where I had to censor every little thing I thought, said, and did, no, there's a reason we have that disclaimer at the beginning that there will be adult content and adult language. So if you've proceeded past that point, you've done so at your own risk and you get what I serve you. This is not Burger King. You will not have it your way. You will like what I give you. And that's just the way it is here. But lest I lose a pile of subscribers who just can't stand that kind of defiance, you're welcome to click the downvote button too if you don't like that either. It's all yours, and what will be, que sera, sera. I am who I am. I prefer to be authentic, and at my age of being ripely middle-aged, yes, I know, despite my charmingly young-sounding voice, I'm much older than I appear. As I sometimes jokingly say, I have a face for radio and a voice for silent movies. We've got what we've got, and we try to work with what we've got to the best of our ability, and with these things that interest us. And what interests us right now is Laura Owens. But should you have ideas of things that you think might interest me, leave them in the comments below. I'm intrigued to fill the void with maybe some other cases, things that might be interesting to touch on. I'm considering looking at the Lori Vallow Daybell case, because that does have some ties into what I originally started this channel for, which was tearing Mormonism to bits because it's a religious cult. It follows all of the bite model things for authoritarian control, which is sort of how cults are defined. Should you find things of that nature, leave me some notes in the comments, and I may entertain them and fill some of this time with other cases other than Laura Owens, because like it or not, now that Laura is on a criminal trial pathway, at some point this thing will come to an end, and we will want to find other things to fill our time with to keep me occupied, shall we say. The whole thing about empty hands are the devil's playground, and we wish to keep these hands busy. And if that means sitting in front of a microphone talking about court cases, that's better than other things that we could be doing, like eating too much candy. But I digress. So back to Laura Owens. I stumbled across this interesting thing, which, to the best of my knowledge, has not been covered anywhere else. I found this thing in the dark recesses of the YouTubes, but if I'm not mistaken, unless it was covered by someone somewhere I missed who doesn't have a large following, and it was just one of those things that was touched on, people moved on when they found it, and that was over a year ago, so be it. But I think it's relevant now because we get some more back history. And one of the things I left as a comment on Schnitzel Ninja's channel, as she keeps us occasionally updated to the progress of the body cam footage. Yes, we're still waiting on that. No, nothing has happened with Dingus's Supreme Court filing, and we're still waiting for more stuff to happen in the criminal case. You know, there's a lot of waiting going on. That's all right. We're patient. But while we're anxiously waiting, we should fill that time with other things. And this is what we are here for. So this was an appearance by one indicted felon, Laura Michelle Owens, on the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, hosted by Srinivas Rao, or I think he calls himself Siri or something. Anyhow, she solicited this interview. She reached out to this podcast creator to sell herself and her Nobody Told Me podcast. And in it, she reveals some very interesting history. Some of this history we have heard before and other things. Some of it is a new spin on that history. And some of it is San Francisco history, which we don't have much of. And as I was about to say, on Schnitzel's channel, she was sort of soliciting some ideas of what else could we talk about. And I was saying, how about things that go back to San Francisco, which has not been a subject of great conversation other than the initial cases that she had with, oh golly, was it Mike or was it Greg? I think it was Mike, right? That was in San Francisco. See, there's so many things that I'm losing it. There's too much to keep track of, and I'm having to let go of some of the other stuff to make room for the new stuff for the criminal trial. We've got limited room in my head, and believe you me, even more limited room in the cubbyhole. So this podcast where she talks about herself does cover some of that San Francisco history. Of particular interest to me, in this previewing of this podcast, this particular episode, was Laura's outrage that police didn't do her bidding. She thought she could go into the police department, make up a whole cockamamie story about being abused, and that the police were just going to haul this guy off and get her out of her life, and then she could use it to sell herself in a self-help podcast way. Well, it didn't go that way. And it has never gone that way, but it's funny to hear her talk about that and being incensed to that when she threw fits that she didn't get her way, which seems to be a theme in her life, I think. She also shares some other things, some other family history that I think is going to be worth discussing as we get there, and some other related comments that I will parallel with that I found on Rich Lieberman's whining and complaining about Ron Owens on his blog and his channel publications, shall we call them. He's kind of a strange man in my view. I know he's got connections to the Owens family. They've got the whole broadcast camaraderie going on, all buddy and broadcast, and it's some of these people I think are just off center, and that's just the nature of the beast of broadcasting. But in that, we get some insights that I have been yearning for, the personality of Ron Owens. I've had my suspicions about him, and I have had some struggles trying to sort and sift through some of that to get to who that man really is. Because I get hung up on the fact that, one, he was a notable broadcaster, and he did get some awards, unlike Jan Black, whose alleged awards we can find no evidence of, nor can we find much evidence of her career before actually relocating to San Francisco and working at least in a radio station. We'll talk more about her in a minute. I don't want to start with her this time because she's gotten a lot of my attention, but we will talk about her more. So there were lots of interesting little tidbits in this interview with Sari Rao. So let us begin.
Laura, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me on today. I am thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So as I was saying before we hit record here, I found out about your work because you wrote in, but as always with guests,
I found out about your work because you wrote in. So there we go. Already we learned that Laura was soliciting herself. We learned about that in her and her mother's interview with the Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort. So this comes as no surprise that she was out there doing what she said she was doing, soliciting herself and her podcast to other quote-unquote influencers. Yes, and in case you didn't know, I will be interjecting. I will leave this show and its link, as long as it exists, in the show notes. You're welcome to hear it without me interrupting. For those of you who just can't stand me interrupting the media workflow, I know some of you Redditors you have this thing that you just can't help it. You want to hear things end to end and you don't want to be bothered by anything in the middle. That's not how we operate here, in case you haven't figured that out. So that's your warning for now.
yes, I picked, there's some method to this madness, which is only my curiosity. And, I read your about page, and I think two things really struck me. One is that you actually host a podcast with your mom, and two is that you have this immense love for horses. And I'm always obsessed with people who are either good or obsessed with unusual things. But before we get into all of that, I want to start asking you, what did your parents do for work, and how did that end up influencing and shaping what you've ended up doing with your life and your career?
It's been a pretty direct correlation. So my parents actually met when they were talk show.
But was it a direct correlation? It wasn't until later, really. Laura tried to be a country singer. That will be our next episode. We will dig into that one really deeply. Laura's very short-lived country music singing career that she tried to have, and it failed miserably. And also, I don't think either of her parents were equestrians until Laura came along and demanded she wanted to be a horse girl. So how the direct correlation happened until later, when she decided she wanted to suckle off the family tit of broadcasting, what parallel is there? It seems like really Laura had no identity until she started stealing it from other people. That's my opinion of what happened, because really that is what happened. She couldn't find anything of her own to really make work. So it's like, well, let's do what mom and dad did, and let's sit and berate people in front of a microphone and pretend that it's self-help guidance. It's bizarre.
Show hosts at the same radio station. My dad's been at the same station now for more than 50 years, and my mom started working there when she was 18. So they met, they fell in love, they continued.
All right, I can't help it. At what age did they fall in love? I wonder. Jan Black being barely legal, and Ron Owens being 30. Ron Owens was also college educated. He had been in a few markets prior to moving to San Francisco, and he falls in love with a just out of high school young lady. That says red flags for me.
Continued hosting radio shows, and somewhere along the way, I caught the bug, and I was trying to resist it for so long, but couldn't do it.
How old were you when that happened?
When I first started to get into broadcasting myself,
Yeah.
I would always go on my dad's show for Take Your Daughter to Work Day from the time I was maybe 6 on, and I would go on there with my sister. She would do the vast majority of the talking because
Well, that's not true. We can find multiple examples of Laura doing all the talking and being alone with another guest in the studio with dear old dad. So take it for what it's worth. You know, as Jack Fox always says, there is truth even in some of the lies and exaggerations. And our point here will be to try and suss that out. So that is our goal this evening, folks. As we go through this, I may do some pontificating and theorizing and speculating. That's my right to do as someone who's very opinionated. And I also happen to have the microphone and the switch. So that's what will happen. You know, it is interesting. Speaking of the sister, you know, we've talked a little more about Sister Sarah before. I think her role is going to be very, very important. And I think this podcast covers why that will be even more. We know that Laura talked to Sarah a lot, and I think this podcast, I think this particular interview specifically, reinforces that connection that Laura and her sister have about sharing personal details.
I was painfully shy, but I got interested in doing a show of my own actually just a few years ago, maybe within the last 4 or 5 years.
So I mean, while you were growing up, I mean, anybody who does a creative career knows that it's, you know, fraught with uncertainty, no guarantees. Did your parents actually encourage this, or did they, you know, suggest something more practical? And I mean, for your dad to have had the same job working at the same radio station for 50 years, that to me is somebody who is committed to craft in a way that so few people are. Because I mean, 50 years nowadays is a lifetime. I mean, you know, I always come back to what Sam Altman said in his startup school, where he said, you know, founders go into startups thinking that they're going to, you know, basically, you know, build this company and exit in 3 to 4 years and go count their cash on a beach somewhere. But he said the reality is a long-term view is your greatest competitive advantage. And he defined a long-term view as 10 years. And your dad has had a 50-year career. That's crazy in one field.
Well, was it 50 years? I think if we're doing exact math, it was 40 something. But what's a few more years when you're being a douchebag on the radio who screwed over some of his colleagues in the KGO nonsense? Oh my goodness.
Field.
And I think I grew up feeling like that was normal. That's what's so crazy is now that I've gotten to be older and I grew up in the hub of the .com world and Silicon Valley, and I realize how crazy that is, that most of my friends are with companies for a couple of years, or like you said, for the most 10 years. But my dad's had this incredibly long career in the same field for the same radio station. And that's not normal. And that's something that is definitely commendable. So the older I get, the more I appreciate that. But you know, I don't think that they really pushed me one way or the other into broadcasting. You would think that they would have pushed me towards it. That would have been my guess, just because both of them did it. But they didn't necessarily do that. I think they wanted me to be a more outgoing person. And I think they thought in a sense that trying to be on the radio or do some sort of broadcasting would be a way for me to come out of my shell. And I guess eventually it was.
Yeah. You know, what did they teach you when you're growing up about craft and commitment, and how did your perception of what they taught you change with age? Because I think it's one thing for somebody to tell a kid, you know, hey, you know, 10,000 hours, whatever it is. And of course, you know, you end up with overly ambitious helicopter parents too, as a byproduct of that. But I wonder, you know, that same advice would land differently with age, right? So I wonder, the things they have taught you about craft, particularly in the arts and in this given field of broadcasting, what did they teach you when you were younger, and how did your perception of that change with age?
My parents, for as much as they were in the same field and involved in really the same topic of trying to talk about current events, had a very different approach to what they did. So I think I learned the craft in a couple of different ways. And that my mom was always really hands-on, and she was the person who was wanting to do hours and hours of research and write out questions. Whereas my dad was somebody who enjoyed watching the news and reading online to find out the latest things going on in politics or celebrity gossip. And he'd just kind of have these ideas off the top of his head. He wouldn't write things down. So
Well, we know Mother Owens was very hands-on in being involved in writing FBI complaints to the Cybercrimes Division. Yeah. I found that just an hour ago. Yeah. My mother helped me talk to the FBI. Yeah. Yes, I'm sure Mother Owens was very hands-on with quite a few things, but I do not think she was very hands-on in disciplining her daughter, parenting her daughter, or having boundaries and expectations, as we have seen in the last several years over the course of this case and cases previous.
I got to see two different approaches, and it worked well for both of them. And then when I decided to get involved in broadcasting and went to both of them to see, hey, what advice would you have? I found that I was naturally drawn a lot more towards my mom's way of thinking, because it made me feel like I couldn't get stumped if I had everything written down and if I knew everything about a person.
If I knew everything about a person, if I stalked them left, right, and sideways, if I followed them in everything they did, I could never be stumped and caught off guard by anything they did to me. Do you see a pattern here, folks? It's showing. We're seeing the petticoats underneath the dress, so to speak.
I would be in a much better situation, and that would make me less anxious. But when I went to my first interview, I was so nervous. I did the interview at my dad's radio station in San Francisco, and showed up with, 3 pages of single-spaced questions for this guest for a half-an-hour interview. And it was crazy. And I went into the room and I'm setting everything up to do the interview. And my dad comes in and I was like, hey, what advice would you have? Like, do you want to see if what I wrote is okay? And he looks at my papers and he tore them up in front of me. And he's like, now you're ready to go. And I cried at the time. I was like, oh my God, what did you just do? What did you just do? And that was very extreme what he did. And I definitely wouldn't thank him for that. But at the same time, I think about that example all the time to remind me.
Okay. All right. I was going to stop that sooner, but we need to talk about that. We need to talk about how Father would do that. I find it bizarre. She tries to use it. She tries to flip it as an object lesson in the positive, but I don't think that's a good way to consider this. To have a parent who's so controlling that they take their child's work, who's trying to start something out and figure out their way, and just rip it to shreds and say, well, now you're ready. We have some anecdotes. While I'm thinking about it, while we're talking about Ron Owens, I think we get, I'll speak for myself. I get a little bit caught in a bias because, we know that he's a noted figure in radio and he's very feeble right now. We don't get to see him in this situation with Laura and her criminal case in his normal energy and in his prime. So I think how we see some of the energies within the Owens family playing out is a little bit deceptive because we're not seeing everyone at their normal or at their best, or maybe we should say at their worst. But we have this interesting little thing. As I alluded to earlier, this is posted on Rich Lieberman's blog page. He posts various YouTube postings that he has created, and he attaches them to his blog spot, and various people comment on them. And someone leaves, there's a couple of people here that leave some anecdotes about Ron's personality, which I thought were very insightful. And these were left on June 14th, so not that long ago. First one says, from Anonymous, Ron was notorious for treating people he worked with badly. Payback is a bitch. Another response to that, another Anonymous says, I worked with him, and he was demanding diva. He was a demanding diva. He would throw support staff under the bus the moment he found someone better, aka younger. And another response, I've heard the same, and that he never cheated on Jan with another woman. On men, I don't know. Well, I suspect, and I think this is why Laura's got men issues, is that her father was not a nice person. And you can take that and you can read between the lines quite a bit. And I think I will go so far as to opine, and again, this is my opinion, I think Ron was abusive. But we don't see that so much because he is so frail and so feeble with all of his medical issues that we don't see nasty Ron as much as we probably used to back when he was not so ill. So I suspect, and again, this is also my opinion, I think Laura's sluttiness and her need to sell herself sexually to just about every man she first encounters, as apparently she did with Clayton Echard, sending him, was it nudes or was it just sexting? I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure that we know all the details of that, and perhaps it doesn't matter, but someone who barely knows another person selling themselves sexually to try and lure them in with what would turn into a paternity scandal and eventually a paternity fraud that would lead to 7 felony counts. It makes you wonder who tweaked their antenna. Was it Daddy Dearest that did something? Was it Mommy Dearest that did something? Or was it Uncle Joe Schmo, who we don't know about, that did something? And that it just damaged an already susceptible mind. We certainly know, well, we certainly believe. Let me phrase it that way. We believe that Laura's mind has got some damage because she doesn't behave like a quote-unquote normal person does. It's weird to fake pregnancies and then fake twins, and then pretend like the whole thing actually happened. And not just you faking them, but getting your whole family, at least your parents, maybe even your sister, maybe even others, we don't know. Get your whole family in on it to tell people on the GoFundMe Facebook page that she was indeed pregnant and you're wrong. We've seen posts on Reddit of people saying those sorts of things, which I'm inclined to believe. I'm sure they're comments that don't stay very long before someone from Family Owens deletes them, because anything that leads someone to find out about Laura's legal troubles and start putting the dots together about this GoFundMe and what its purposes may be for, well, they would just lose funding. And to be so conniving as to take out ads, allegedly to promote that Facebook page and to promote the GoFundMe for Ron Owens' alleged medical expenses and other needs, it should make one question. And I wonder how many people may be taking their money back now that all of this news about Laura Owens and her criminal trial is gaining lots of airtime. Things aren't quite as hot as they used to be, but it is still being discussed. Anyhow, back to the characteristics of Ron Owens and parents. I think Ron was not a nice person. I think he was potentially an abusive person. I've already said that. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it is already getting late into the evening. We tend to do that as the minutes click by. Not much is said about him other than that in this particular interview, but the fact that a parent would take their child's work, rip it to shreds, and say, "Oh, you're ready now. Go have at it, kiddo." That's disturbing. That's disturbing. If I had a parent shred up my notes for some big project I was working on, I wouldn't have been quite so happy about it. I certainly wouldn't have taken it on the chin, although I was a fairly quiet child for the most part. I didn't like to speak unless I was expected to be spoken to, or, classroom settings and all that kind of thing when you're younger. But I digress. Let's see what else Laura has to say in this Unmistakable creative podcast where she's bearing her soul.
That I don't need to rely on what is written, and that I pretty much have the answers and have the questions because I've done my research and I don't need to rely on a piece of paper. But I also learned so much from my mom about how to do the engineering for the show. And my dad at this point still doesn't know the first thing about that after that many years in the industry. He wouldn't have a clue how to adjust volumes or even press play and record. So I'm lucky that my mom knew all that.
And this is interesting as we think back to the whole debacle with PS Creative Studios and the mess that Laura Michelle Owens and Dingus the Douche Canoe created with that podcast studio, saying that audio was unusable because, well, either Laura's a lying bitch in this interview or she was a lying bitch at what they received from the creative studio. We know she was. It was demonstrated the materials that were given to her that she couldn't figure out for whatever reason, or it was some sort of excuse not to release that nasty podcast episode they had created at that particular podcast studio. So it's odd to me to have Laura going on about what she learned from her mother when it came to recording and engineering and all those kinds of things. It may be true. Jan could know some things about that. I don't know. It's hard to tell from what I've seen about her. She seems a little bit fuddy-duddy, but what do I know? It's not that hard. It's not that hard. I mean, I'm sitting here in front of this multicolored Rode Podcaster Pro 2 thing we somehow find ways to make it all work. And I'm only reasonably reasonable. I am not a genius. So it makes us wonder if Ron, Daddy Owens, was just a personality. He was just talent. And he had to have servants take care of him to make him a success. That doesn't seem to be beyond the realm of possibility, that he just had a bunch of people to take care of him and cater to him, just like Laura expected to have all the rest of the world take care of her, especially men she was targeting and trying to extort into a relationship. Interesting stuff. I think the character traits of both parents found a very nasty and volatile combination of both in their daughter Laura.
Yeah. So, I have to ask about, the kind of chemistry that happens on air with two people so much so that they end up getting married. Like, what in the world led to that?
I hear different versions of this story all the time. They actually didn't have a show together. They worked opposite shifts on the radio station, with my mom working morning drive and my dad worked nights. So I think they would just kind of pass each other. And apparently they were the only two somewhat young people at the station. Like I mentioned, my mom was 18 when she started, and I know she was 19 when she met my dad. And
I've got to stop it there. That's creepy. He's in his 30s. She's barely legal. It's creepy. Tell me it's not creepy, folks. I mean, maybe I'm just being silly that there's such an age gap there where this guy, this established guy, is hitting. Who's hitting on whom here? That's the question. Ultimately, that is the question. Did mom, who was really nobody, in my opinion, who came from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and while she claims she had a radio career as a teenager in New Mexico, which I've not been able to find any proof of other than her claim. It's all self-reported. There's nothing to corroborate what she says she did as either a child star on TV at the age of, 4, or being a quote-unquote DJ as a teenager. I have found zero evidence of that, and I cannot help but wonder this about Mother Owens. We'll talk about Mother Owens for a minute. If she fled Albuquerque because, maybe she came from an abusive household, this is me speculating. Let me be very clear about this. I don't have solidified evidence of this, but it stands to reason that at high school, at graduation, mom had enough of being in Albuquerque, perhaps living with her own parents. She fled to San Francisco, and she just sort of happened to have a job, maybe doing something like what she was doing before, which was probably entry-level stuff at a radio station. It's unusual to have a child on air, even in those days. Usually you want seasoned people who know how to handle equipment and how to do an announcing job, and that takes maturity. Well, unless you're working for a station that wants PDF files is the only thing I can think of where you want all these young children running around on air. No, that doesn't happen, folks. It just doesn't. So the Jan Black story of her early beginnings in radio have me still questioning any validity of all of it. And given how we've seen Laura's behavior, I would not be surprised, and others have speculated this as well, that a young, impressionable Jan Black, Mama Owens, saw this handsome older guy who was the hot shot on KGO radio and if I latch onto that, I might be able to become something, since I'm not something now. I don't think she could have been much of anything without hitching her wagons to Ron. That's my opinion, but I think it's an accurate one. She was young. She was, I think, inexperienced. We have found no evidence for her having any experience. And if she did, she would have been young enough where that would have been experience that wasn't very mature. You aren't going to see lots of youngsters doing very adult things in very professional settings like broadcast. You just aren't, even in the 60s and 70s. And we've spent some time. The royal we and the mouse in my pocket here in the cubbyhole. I've spent quite a bit of time looking at all of the old recordings and other documents in the Radio Hall of Fame and so forth, and I could find nothing that can be attributed to Jan Black other than one little station identification moment that sounds like her voice, essentially reading call letters of KGO radio. Or no, was it no, it could have been KCBS. And it was nothing special. I think it was sort of a holiday station identification, and that was it. There's nothing in any of that stuff There's no shows, there's no recordings of shows of her or anything else. Not even recordings of Jan Black giving the news on momentous news days, such as, what was it, the Loma Prieta earthquake, where allegedly KCBS, who she was working for at the time, received awards that she claims she got. So I have extreme doubts about all of Mother Owens' origin stories. I don't think they're factual. I think they're padded. I think a lot of them are made up because, being the wife of legendary KGO radio star Ron Owens, she needed a little more than just, well, I'm the humble wife. Although, what's wrong with that, quite frankly? But the narcissism that seems to run on all sides of the Owens gene pool, the Owens/Black gene pool, or the Elizabeth Naylor gene pool and Ron Owens gene pool, we seem to like making up stories that sound appealing to people to sell ourselves. That seems to be the Owens raison d'etre. Oh my goodness. All right. So let's carry on with more of this interview. I could go on and on more about Mother Owens as I try and pick them apart further, because there's more there. There's a lot of social dynamics. Well, you know what? Let's keep. Why not? We're stopped. We've stopped the recording. Let's keep going a little further with Mother Owens while I'm thinking about it. I think Ron was fairly demanding. I think he could have been abusive, perhaps even physically abusive, if not verbally abusive. Again, these are my opinions. I'm not a mental health practitioner. I am not a medical expert of any kind. I don't practice in any medical or mental health thing. These are just my opinings, right? A demanding father who has bad relationships and perhaps other issues with his daughter, and a mother, despite being a stay-at-home mother, Jan Black, Elizabeth Naylor Owens, being a poor mother. Here's my thinking on some of the parenting dynamics of the Owens household and Laura's childhood. It seems to me that Ron Owens was probably a pretty nasty diva. We've got some at least anonymous anecdotal evidence of that on Richie Lieberman's blog posts. I think that to be true. We've got some evidence in Laura's own reminiscing of her early start in radio and her father tearing up her show note questions and those kinds of things. I think the guy was probably a raging asshole. But we kind of lose sight of that in his frailty these days. And we can't be too sure, looking now into the past, that he wasn't. If he was a raging asshole, and Mama Owens, the stay-at-home Mama Owens, who seems to have been very hands-off with parenting, I could see lots of opportunities for there to be lots of damage to be happening to lots of children. Now, that's not an allegation. I'm not alleging that abuse did in fact happen, but it seems to be an indicator when we consider some of Laura's behavior and how she represents herself when first meeting men that she has some interest in. We see certain patterns of behavior in how Laura likes to represent herself. She seems to be very sort of sexually charged, trying to get men's attention, and for a man who's thinking the wrong way, that would be maybe at least initially appealing. But these things, these sorts of behaviors of how Laura has progressed, do not form in a vacuum. They come from somewhere, and it's my belief, and it's my opinion that it came from bad parenting, and it probably came from possibly abusive parenting. If we consider that Ron Owens may have been an asshole, as it sounds like he was, that translates. That translates to how parenting happens with one's children. And it's possible. And again, this is my opinion. I don't have substantive evidence to prove this other than some of the anecdotes of other people being shared publicly, that Ron was a jerk. And a jerk father tends to translate into bad behaviors from daughters and creating bad relationship interactions with men that the daughters may be interested in. And if we tie that with a sort of distant and somewhat cold Mother Owens, I don't get much loving effusiveness from that woman. She seems to be very sterile, very clinical, very businesslike. Even in her other interviews that we have on the Nobody Told Me podcast, we may touch on that one, the Father's Day, where Ron Owens himself makes an appearance with Mother Owens and Laura. I don't get much love there. I don't get sort of that warm, cuddly stuff that, you see lovey-dovey couples have after many years of marriage and having kids. It all seems to be very transactional and very businesslike. So it makes me wonder what sort of marriage that these two people had. And again, Mother Owens was quite young. You notice that Laura didn't give us a date that they were married, and I haven't been able to find one. Without going down to San Francisco and digging through the Hall of Records, for lack of better terms, I'm not sure I can actually put a definitive date on that. But we do know that she was quite young when Ron and Jan Black met. But a number of years transpired before they had their first child. That's quite a number of years. I think, if my math is correct, nearly 12 from the time they met and supposedly fell in love to Sarah being born. So it raises lots of questions about that relationship just between mother and father. And then we start to pair those dynamics in behaviors we see with children. And again, things don't form in a vacuum. The acting out of a child tends to result from the parenting, or lack thereof, from the parents. The family unit is a particularly fascinating thing for people to study psychologically, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. So let's carry on. Let's carry on in this interview with Laura and Servi Rao.
My dad was 30, and I guess they just had some sort of chemistry and the same sense of humor that drew them to each other, and they didn't date for the first year, I believe. They were just good friends, and then one thing led to another, and
yeah, sure. That's the sanitized version, I think. Well, they were just friends, and then one thing led to another. Yeah, he was 30 and she was barely 18. Yeah, right.
Yeah, they got married, they had 2 kids, and even now you can see that they still have that.
They got married, and then all this time goes by just in the blink of an eye, and they had kids, and I'm here, Laura Michelle Owens, and I'm great. We're leaving a lot out. I want to know what happened within that swath of over a decade. That's going to be very insightful.
Banter back and forth, and just kind of a spark that is unique.
So I have to ask, what do you think it is that makes that kind of a spark last for so long? I'm curious because this is a subject that I've researched endlessly and I'm still single. So this is just out of personal morbid curiosity.
I was going to say, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask this. I've been trying to figure that out myself as well. I think that what they have going that so many people are lacking is that they have, well, one thing is a shared history at this point, which I think makes a big difference. And I know we all can't start with that. So maybe that's not the answer you're looking for, but they do have that sense of humor, which the older I've gotten, the more I've realized how important of a factor that is. And I think they have very similar values and morals. They're different religions, and in a lot of ways, I would say they're opposites, but they have, at their core, they're very similar. And I just see every day that they want to make each other better. They want to make sure the other one's informed. They talk about current events all the time and try and stay relevant. And it's beautiful to see something like that has lasted so long.
So I want to come back to that.
Yuck. They don't go out on dates and do love dates together, but they do keep each other informed on current events. I think we're missing some things. And I'm also thinking, here I am, 40 some odd minutes into this, I think I might make this a multi-parter. Maybe just to spread it around. If nothing else, my voice is not going to hold out forever because, well, that's just the things I have to deal with on my own. We'll get to a certain point here, and then I'm going to cut it off, even though we haven't gotten very far into this. Sorry. I was rambling on a little too much, but we'll trim some of the fat in editing. It'll be okay. But I think there's enough here that there may be enough to make this a multi-parter. We'll keep some momentum going. I will add what I need to, and I will break this up as I so desire. And if it just so happens that in the middle of all this we get breaking news, that's fine. It'll be okay. I've been holding off on this because I kept fearing that the second I drop something, we're going to get the body cam footage, and then I'm going to be distracted for a couple hours or days.
But I have to ask you about this love affair that you have with horses. That seems like a very strange backdrop for everything else going on here, particularly in the heart of Silicon Valley where you grew up.
Oh, isn't it just the weirdest thing? And it's even weirder because I grew up in San Francisco proper. So
oh, wow.
I grew up, the last place you would ever think that people would ride horses. And there was one stable in the city that I went to a summer camp at when I was 8 years old. And my love for horses just started then, and I was the most fearful rider you could ever imagine. Like, I don't think I got on the horse for the first year, but for some reason, I was just determined to learn how to do this and spent all my time researching about horses and, watching videos and doing everything I could to try to learn how to overcome this fear that I had of riding and try to figure out some way to just figure out how to be with these animals that I so badly wanted to have a relationship with. And so as the stable closed, I ended up having to drive further and further out to pursue that passion, to the point where now I spend easily 2 hours a day in the car, um, going to see the horses every single day. And it blossomed into this huge passion that became a business that I run with my mom. In addition to the podcast, we have a business buying and selling horses, and I compete almost every week. Even with COVID, it's starting to be back to normal a little bit, but yeah, it's an obsession. It's not even just a passion; it's an obsession. I don't even know what my life would look like without the horses.
Okay, so the way that you talk about horses sounds a lot like the way that I've talked about surfing and snowboarding.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like? What happens when you get on a horse that makes it this way for you, or for anybody? And like, what is like? What are the things that we don't know? Because I mean, to me, like, I see horses and I think, Zorro. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
the extent of my understanding is
Yeah.
old movies where people are riding horses and fighting on
Uh-huh.
swords and all sorts of crazy shit like that. But you obviously have your firsthand experience with it. So what is it that draws people to horses the way that you're drawn to it? What is the feeling of it, when you're on a horse?
I don't even know if I would say that it's something you feel as a whole with every animal that you get on, so much as it is learning each horse's personality and then realizing they have their quirks and they have their strengths. And you get to work together to figure all of that out together. And it's really building a partnership with an animal that you can't talk to. They can't talk back, and you're trying to figure out how to do things that are crazy together. I jump horses. And so the idea that two different beings can go around and jump a course of jumps and make it look easy when they really can't communicate is just beautiful, and it's amazing. And every horse is so different. Um, and that's really what the challenge is for me, that after all these years, it's not like you can have it figured out on all horses. You can't even have it figured out on one. Even my long-term partners, I still learn so much about them all the time, but they're just fascinating, and they're really unique on the ground too. When you're just hanging around them, they're really funny. My family's had the same pony. This is like a pet. It's not an investment, that I've had since I was a little girl, and she's hilarious. She still makes me laugh every day.
Hmm. So this might be a weird question, but you take the ability to communicate with an animal who can't talk back. I wonder how that influences your ability to communicate and connect with people in your life.
That's really interesting, and I've actually never thought about it that way, but I think it's made me a better listener. I also have a real passion for rescuing senior dogs who, gosh, you wish you could understand what their story was before they came to you, especially since so many of them were abused. But yeah, it does make you a better listener. And I think you have a curiosity about what happened to you and why did you become the way you were. And you're never going to hear the answer, but it's interesting to try and figure it out on your own.
Hmm. So, walk me through sort of the trajectory of sort of that first spark of, falling in love with broadcast journalism to what you're doing today. Like, what was the path to getting here?
I really would not have had any interest in doing a podcast of my own were it not for an experience that I had in an abusive relationship that made me really try to figure out who I was as a person and have this obsession with trying to become a better person. And I turned to all these podcasts and books on self help, self improvement, and entrepreneurship books. I mean, just trying to figure out how to be a more successful and happy person. And it was from becoming obsessed with those things that I decided I wanted to figure out how I could put my own take on it and help other people figure.
And that will set us up, everyone, for part 2 of this episode of Femme, Fetal, Laura Michelle Owens, where she will talk more about her quote-unquote abusive relationship. If I'm not mistaken, that's with Mike Maricini. And she will reveal how she behaved and how she tried to get people to believe her, and how she tried to monetize and capitalize on the abuse she was creating with other men that she was involving herself in, and how things didn't quite go the way she expected. So stay tuned for next part. I think we'll make this only a 2-parter, and maybe I'll keep my mouth just a little more shut in the next part, and we can get through some of that stuff a little bit quicker, because it is interesting stuff and it is insightful stuff. So we will carry on. So stay tuned for part 2.
Why do we have to, every time Rachel says something, you're just like, oh, you're not listening. It's just like, I don't get it. She is listening. She's listening to every word you say. And she's presenting something, and then you come back and shake your head and sigh.
Okay. Anyway.
Submit to an interview.
Wow. Stop. Well, if you let me. We're moving on to the next question. We're not gonna get very far with that. So
I can prove that this is not the first time she's done it. But even if you disagree with me,
I felt like I was juggling a flaming chainsaw while having my leg bitten by a German Shepherd. Okay. All right. We're moving on to the next question.
what lawyer ever says that?
Well, you're welcome that I gave you that's such an easy way to roast me.
You know it's a possibility you might not win something. We're talking about the appeal.
There's no chance you lost this appeal.
Yeah.
You will have this.
Rachel, here, can I offer you like a cookie or something? What do you want me to say? What do you want me to say?
Not that. In our case, we like our case.
I shouldn't have said that. Can we move on? Okay.
Yeah.
Pull it up. These statutes were invoked.
Yeah. Okay. Hang on. You're getting. Okay.
But show me a case that says that, because your cases don't. I've read them all now. Just give me a quote from Holgate. Just give me a quote from Holgate.
Can you hang on? Can you hang on for just a second here? Okay. Lord. Okay. You are pretending. Wait. If you want me to stay on this, you need to let me have fair opportunity to answer, okay?
David, of 58 minutes, you've probably talked for 42 of them. I mean, come on, man.
Okay, guys.
Hold on.
Let me...
I got the
Rachel.
case somewhere.
Oh,
There's
God.
only the Rule 11. Hold on. There's other authority. What was at issue in that case?
We got to move on. We got to move on from that.
So, is the whole point. Tried to withdraw it. There were other issues before the court.
Oh, for God's sake. Okay, Steve, can we move on? Because we're not going to get...
And then you come back and shake your head and sigh.
I know,
Because
but...
you don't have any authority to infringe his copyright or whatever, that I interfered with his...
But way before my time. Way before I was there.
Way before you're there. Where are these children?
Okay, you ready?
Where are they, David? This is the one thing that I think everybody wants to know.
Okay.
She's still 6 months pregnant. Can I show my belly? How would she have a belly in November if she miscarried in July or August?
Look.
It's still not appropriate for her to include that finding of fact. Where are the people? There were reasons that her findings would have been inadmissible.
My Lord. Steve. Oh, my God.
And then Rachel gets 5 to 10 seconds before you sigh.
Read the emails with Clayton, the emails with Greg, the text messages with Mike. 5 that it is, but something that purports to be.
Whatever.
If you would have won, I mean, obviously, if you would have won, you would have gloated too.
Here, sign something saying that you raped me, that Laura was pregnant. I don't know what that would be. I mean, she's been running around subpoenaing things, apparently.